The leak of a draft Supreme Court opinion.
The Supreme Court.
The court that dark money built.
Breaking news at the Supreme Court.
The landmark Roe v. Wade case.
A woman's constitutional right to an abortion.
My body, my choice.
And Leonard Leo, who really is responsible for helping Trump fill the Supreme Court.
A Supreme Court decision with dramatic consequences. The justices ruling 5-4.
You look at the decisions like Shelby County that attacked voting rights, and then you look at the dark money cases like Citizens United. It's not just us.
The court is not in order. This is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and welcome to Making the Case. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of my podcast, Making the Case, in which we will go through how a captured court delivers for big special interests some very harmful decisions for the American people. My guests in this episode of the podcast are the wonderful Tiffany Muller, the president of End Citizens United and Let America Vote, the group that devotes itself to protecting the voice and vote of every American. She's a former elected official, having held local office, and has served as a high-level staffer in state and federal government. She will be joined also by Kris Brown, the president of the Brady campaign, one of the nation's leading gun violence prevention groups. She has spent years at Brady, served as a staffer in Congress, and has been a long champion of common sense solutions to end gun violence. And our third participant is Doug Linder, the Senior Director of Judiciary and Democracy at the League of Conservation Voters, a champion environmental organization. Doug is a lawyer, democracy advocate, and political strategist. Tiffany, let's start with you. In 2010, the Roberts Court handed down what is one of its most disastrous opinions, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. That was a pretty awful decision on its merits, but it included two factual premises. One, all the unleashed spending was going to be independent of candidates. And two, all the unleashed spending was going to be transparent. Voters would know who was behind the ads. Let us know what Citizens United has done and how well those two promises of independence and transparency have held up.
Well, first, Senator, thank you so much for having me here today. It's such an honor to join you to talk about these important issues. Citizens United took two really terrible ideas and it combined them together. And it said that money equals speech and that corporations are people, and it allowed them to basically put a for sale sign on our democracy. It was the decision that gave rise to super PACs, and it really put dark money on steroids in our elections. And what we've seen since then is that the pace of spending in our elections has just skyrocketed. And these ideas, these foundational premises that it would be independent and it would be transparent, have turned out to be a total sham. We know that the transparency was to be able to root out corruption and to be able to see the conflicts that exist behind the spending. But we have more dark money in our elections than we ever have. In 2020, there was actually $1 billion of dark money spent in our elections.
The premise of Citizens United in some respects was that dark money is corrupting.
Exactly right.
That's why they had to go the transparency route, right?
That's exactly right. 8 of the justices actually all said we needed to have transparency. We needed to be able to trace back where the money is coming from. But there's more dark money than there ever has been. There's actually less transparency than there ever has been. And the independence argument is also a complete sham. You have campaigns that are setting up super PACs with their political operatives and their top campaign operatives. And, there's this famous anecdote of Speaker Paul Ryan actually walking in and giving a speech to a super PAC and then walking out of the room so that his top operative could ask for $30 million, right? It is all a sham to get around the spending limits of the contribution limits that the FEC has set up.
And how honorable has the Supreme Court been about vouchsafing these two premises? It's obvious from the newspaper that it's not transparent. John McCain and I wrote a brief together saying, hey, you're wrong. This stuff wasn't transparent. It was a bipartisan brief. John knew a lot about campaign finance. They ignored it. Has there been any response from the court to the plain knowledge that they were wrong in these foundational premises?
Not at all. If anything, we've seen them go the opposite way, right? In Americans for Prosperity case, we actually saw them begin to defend dark money and actually take previous findings that were meant to protect civil rights activists and try to apply that to billionaires who are trying to buy our elections. Congress has had the ability to pass disclosure laws and demand transparency since the Citizens United case. You have been fighting for that your entire career, and we have seen time and time again that come up for a vote, and the Republicans continue to filibuster those efforts. So both congressional action and from the courts, we have seen there be no action to actually undo the dark money that has now flooded our system.
Telling little fact, in the Americans for Prosperity Foundation case, the petitioner in that case was Americans for Prosperity Foundation. That is a 501c3 organization organized under the tax code. There's another organization called Americans for Prosperity, right? Same name, except foundation is tagged onto the 501c3. The Americans for Prosperity, the 501c4, is the top political battleship of the Koch brothers' political operation. And in comes Americans for Prosperity Foundation, which shares directors, office space, funders, and the Supreme Court, which knows these groups perfectly well because they spent millions to support the Supreme Court justices' nominations. And they act as if Americans for Prosperity Foundation is this nominal, innocent, nothing to see here, folks, little 501c3. It was kind of stunning that they overlooked that unbelievably salient fact.
It's only stunning, I think, if we don't remember the hundreds of millions of dollars that they have spent to help stack the court, right?
Yeah.
And instead, if you look at that, then
most of it dark money.
Most of it dark money. And coming from these networks of dark money, whether it's Americans for Prosperity or Leonard Leo's dark money network. And then suddenly it becomes much more clear how these decisions come to be made.
Yeah. Go back and listen to episode 1 with Lisa Graves, who's tracked $580 million into the court capture operation. So, Tiffany, how does this work out in real life? I mean, this isn't just a technical campaign finance question. What are the harms? How have you seen this play out?
Well, I mean, I think that you see it play out in a few ways. And number one, let's talk about how everyday Americans feel. And we spend a lot of our time talking to Americans across the country. And what they feel is that they have no voice, no vote, and no power in their government. As a matter of fact, I heard the staggering statistic the other day that I'm going to share with you. 60% of Americans actually think that they can influence the way a corporation acts through their buying power or through boycotts, but only 4% of Americans actually believe that they can influence the way that their government officials act. 4%. They have lost faith and trust in who their government is working for, and they feel like it's working for whoever can write the biggest check. And sadly, we've seen that to be true. And if we look at any pressing issue that we know Americans across party lines want addressed, we can see how the money is creating gridlock and dysfunction. So from climate change to lowering prescription drug prices to gun safety to LGBTQ rights. And Senator, I've heard you say time and again, and I love this particular example, that prior to Citizens United, there are 14 instances of Senate Republicans co-sponsoring or voting on bills to help address major climate change. And since Citizens United and the oil and gas industry becoming the biggest spender in Republican elections, what we've seen is that there are now 0 Republicans willing to stand up and join forces to address climate change. It's how we can have, 90% of Americans wanting a gun background check bill and yet not being able to get that done because the NRA spent $170 million in the recent elections.
So, what a segue.
Happy to help.
Speaking of the NRA spending big checks in elections, Kris, we started this battle over gun violence years ago with a Republican Chief Justice of the Supreme Court saying that the notion that the Second Amendment created a personal right to bear arms, not just a public right, was, and I'm quoting him here, one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public by special interest groups, end quote. That's where we started. Then the NRA went to work. What's become of that?
Well, a travesty. I don't have to tell you, and thank you for including me, Senator, and also to my great colleague and honestly warrior in this fight, Tiffany, who is really making a huge difference around this. It takes all of us in this fight. And I am so appreciative that us together are truly making a difference. And what we're doing, I will say, is not so much about politics. So I'll answer your question this way. It's not about politics. Most Americans agree with respect to my issue, gun violence, what should happen, whether you're a gun owner or a non-gun owner, you believe, should we have expanded Brady background checks? 94% of Americans think that should happen. Even with assault weapons, now we're over 50%. The issue is, in the end, what happens in our legislatures, right? The House of Representatives and the Senate. And that's about gerrymandering and the basics of democracy. What I feel
So to interject, gerrymandering protected by the United States Supreme Court and defended by the United States Supreme Court, despite the fact that the public hates it. But go ahead.
Right. What I feel about these issues is that we are at a generational change. We can and we are seeing an opportunity for younger people in this country, the millennials and then the younger folks beyond them. They care about our issues, which are very basic, in a way that we have not seen in any elections really before 2018. And they're going to come to vote. And that's the difference that those kinds of voters will make, because they want background checks. They want extreme risk protection laws. They want assault weapons bans. They want to have all of these different things we're focusing on. So that's the difference that this kind of movement and gun violence prevention can make around these issues.
And because of all that, they couldn't get what they wanted done through Congress. If you tried to get a personal right to bear arms through Congress, it would be associated with a whole bunch of other gun safety protections, like proper background checks and bans on massive magazines and so forth. So they went to the court instead, where they could get what they wanted. And that's why Kavanaugh was auditioning for his Supreme Court seat, talking about gun rights. That's why they wanted to be in the room with Leonard Leo when they were putting the Trump lists together in the back room of the Federalist Society. Talk a little bit about the damage that's been done by the court. And if you don't mind, reference the law changes that they just cooked up in the Bruen case.
It's been substantial. So with Liberty from You, I'll go back before Bruen, which was Heller, right? Yep. Before the Heller decision, which I think was 1993 or 1994, the version of the Second Amendment in this country that had been understood and interpreted was as a collective right. It just means if you are acquiring or owning a gun, that means it's part of a group. And so you have no individual right to own a gun. And that is consistent with the entire history of the Second Amendment. And then Heller happened. And that was, I think, in 2008. And what Scalia in his decision rendered at that time, which I think is frankly incorrect, is, well, this is a collective right. And he wrote out the idea that the Second Amendment was based on a well-regulated militia, although the plain text of the Second Amendment says it's about a well-regulated militia. More or less what he said is you have a right outside of your home and also within your home, which is unprecedented, to have a gun. And there aren't that many limits on the government to stop you. Fast forward today, we have a decision in Bruin. That's the decision that the Supreme Court issued 12 months ago.
Yep.
That expands Heller and says any state that has a restriction on the carrying of firearms in public, then that's at risk. You can't have a permitting system around those restrictions. So that's where we are now. And what we are fighting every day at Brady is to secure a different interpretation of that, but also, frankly, more consistent with the legacy and history of our Second Amendment. And that's a big part of the arguments we're making now about how we need to ratchet back gun violence in this country, which is now at an all-time high.
And they did that in part by looking back at history and tradition to laws that existed when the best marksmen in the country would have trouble firing and reloading and firing again their musket in a minute. And now any fool can pull on a trigger and fire multiple rounds per second, creating an entirely new and unforeseen risk at the time of the founding of these mass murders that have become so commonplace now in our society. And they just scrub all that technology away.
That's right. That's exactly what happens. And it's part of the big lie that we face, right? The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? We're rife in the last 20 years with that kind of marketing technique. But let's be clear about that. That's not because it's true. It's because it's by the gun industry to sell more guns. And your statement and what you're making is a part of that, right? And we are facing in our country a lobby, an industry that is now, with gun violence being the number one killer of our children, depriving us of basic civil rights.
Yeah, the basic right as a people to defend ourselves from gun violence by going to our legislatures and hashing it out in public and passing laws to defend ourselves. That is the right that got taken away for the sake of the gun lobby.
Well, let me say it more plainly. The right not to be shot.
That would be more plainly. Well said. That's what we're dealing with. The numbers confirm it.
I also want to change the narrative about how we tell the stories of gun violence because it's completely inaccurate now.
Well, dark money can create narrative and dark money can create mythology as well. And I think you've got to be attentive to that. Well, let me switch to Doug, who hasn't had much of a chance to engage. If there's one group that has the biggest interest and incentive to capture the court, it's polluters. And we've had a spate of decisions out of the Supreme Court that have been incredibly polluter-friendly. Talk a little bit about the West Virginia case, which didn't even really seem to have a proper live legal case or controversy going on when the Supreme Court took it up.
Yeah, thank you, Senator, and thank you for all your leadership on climate and the courts. The West Virginia case is a wild one. And so for just some brief background here, the EPA has a legal obligation under the Clean Air Act, a law passed by Congress, to regulate climate pollution from power plants. This is one of the most significant drivers of the climate crisis, and it is well established that the EPA not only can, but must regulate that climate pollution. So the EPA scientists and experts under the Obama administration put forth this regulation, the Clean Power Plan, which was, at the time, before the Inflation Reduction Act, the most ambitious climate action in American history. And before that ever went into effect, the fossil fuel industry immediately ran to their friends in the court and said, please save us from clean air. And so even as that regulation was making its way through the lower courts, even as lower courts had declined to block it during the pendency of the litigation, the United States Supreme Court made the unprecedented decision in 2016 to reach down into that lower court and block the Clean Power Plan from going into effect while it was in litigation. That was in 2016. Over the subsequent 4 years, Senate Republicans and Donald Trump, with the help of their polluter allies and their money, were able to shift the Supreme Court even further to the right than it was in 2016. And so we have this West Virginia case coming back. And this is an unprecedented one, again, because after President Obama left office, Donald Trump came in, the Trump EPA rescinded the Clean Power Plan and put forth their own regulation that was not going to do much on climate, but was intended to occupy the space to prevent action from being taken in the future. And that Trump plan was itself thrown out by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. President Biden and his EPA had said that they were not going to bring back either the Obama plan or the Trump plan, so there was no plan in place.
Obama plan rescinded, Trump plan thrown out by courts, and Biden plan as yet undeveloped, and they had said they wouldn't try to pursue either the Obama or the Trump plan. So there's nothing.
Absolutely. And one of the few constitutional limitations on the U.S. Supreme Court, which is one of the most powerful courts in the world, by the way. Most major democracies don't have a court that has this much power over public policy. One of the few limitations on their power is they're not supposed to exercise it unless there's a live case or controversy, which there wasn't here because there was no regulation to opine on. But they decided they were going to rule on the Obama rule anyway, even though it had been rescinded and the administration in office had said they were not going to bring it back. And they ruled on it in this decision last summer in West Virginia versus EPA, in which they invented this vague, hand-wavy new doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine that essentially says that when a federal regulatory agency that protects the people from powerful special interests does something that's too big a deal, the court might reach down and say, agency, that's too big a deal. We're not going to let you do that. And they applied it in this case to dramatically narrow the EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate climate pollution from power plants. And so now the EPA still has significant authority to do that, and the Biden administration is working on that. But a number of their significant tools in the toolbox that by a regular reading of the Clean Air Act should have been available to them no longer are available because these justices just didn't want them to be, and in part because they know that the fossil fuel industry is their friend. The fossil fuel industry helped them get the power they have. And so they are using that power to take authority away, not just from the scientists and experts at the agency, but from the Congress that passed those laws, from the president who was elected to run that agency, from the voters who elected them. And taking that power, the justices taking that power for themselves so they can use it to serve the industry.
And here's an interesting backstory. I think 20 Republican attorneys general who were part of the Republican Attorneys General Association, RAGA, filed briefs or were parties in that West Virginia versus EPA decision. RAGA received most of its funding from a group called the Concord Fund, which is a front group for Leonard Leo, who listeners to this podcast will know was the billionaire fixer who orchestrated the Federalist Society lists that blocked Garland and got Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett onto the court. So he's deeply admired in the dark money fixery of getting people onto the court, and he's funding the Republican attorneys general who come in an obedient flock and file the briefs that the big fossil fuel donors want. Fine mess, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think that it is certainly clear that this.
And none of it's disclosed, by the way.
And none of it is disclosed. And it is, clear from reading the court's, tortured reasoning and the way they're manipulating the law on this, as well as those interests that are involved, that this is about pursuing a political agenda rather than following the law. Even Justice Elena Kagan, who I would argue is the most moderate justice currently on the court, has said in her dissent in West Virginia v. EPA that this case represented the court appointing itself as the national environmental policymaker. And that's a very scary thing because that is not their constitutional role, because nobody voted for them, and because a majority of the court is serving polluter interests.
So let's kick over from a safe climate and clean air to clean water, because coal-fired power plants and petrochemical facilities and other industrial sites have a lot to do with polluting the waters of the United States. What are the recent accomplishments of the Roberts Court and the right-wing Federalist Society majority in that space?
Well, it's not great. They are, once again, meddling in environmental policy to serve the polluters. So Sackett versus EPA is a decision that came out just a few weeks ago, I believe 3 weeks ago today as we're recording this. And that case dramatically narrowed the scope of the Clean Water Act's protections for wetlands and streams. And that means it imperils clean drinking water for millions of Americans. It means greater risk of flooding when our wetlands are not protected to be barriers for that flooding, which of course is a bigger and bigger risk amid the climate crisis. These are problems that intersect. It means greater health problems as dirty water makes us sick. It means greater economic problems as the communities and businesses that rely on that water, as well as on their employees and patrons and everyone else to be able to be healthy and participate in our society, are harmed by this, as well as higher healthcare costs and so much else. The court, in this case, was relatively clear that they thought the scope of the Clean Water Act as written by Congress was not good for business, and for that reason, they wanted to roll it back dramatically. And this is another one in which Justice Kagan came back and said, this represents them appointing themselves as the decision maker on environmental policy. And it's very scary because this is not just an abstract thing that affects, someone else over there or some other nature over there that you might not think about. This affects us as people who use and consume water and who live in a society that depends on it. And the fact that it came 1 year after West Virginia v. EPA, the fact that they are so invested in serving polluter interests, the fact that Justice Thomas's benefactor Harlan Crow has some deep financial interests in the outcome of this case and is tied to organizations that filed amicus briefs in support of the Sacketts, are all very concerning things, both for clean water and also for the court itself and our system of government, because they are using their power in bad faith to achieve ends that are not just unpopular, but also very dangerous.
And that was the purpose of the scheme to capture the court, because none of this stuff would have passed Congress. I think even Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate would have had trouble swallowing these things legislatively. But with a court that you can control, you can get what you want without having to go through the democratic process. And if you can couch it in the terms of the Constitution, Congress can't even fix it.
That is absolutely true. And because these justices have life tenure, they can afford to make unpopular decisions that even Republicans in Congress might not want to make. Even if they like the court's decision, they don't have to be the ones to vote for it because the justices can do it for them. Not only do the justices not face accountability, but they also don't face much of a threat to their power. And that also is part of the story.
So the concept here is of a captured court. If listeners want to do a little research, you can Google regulatory capture or agency capture, 2 words for the same thing. It's when powerful special interests take over an administrative or regulatory agency. That is a strategy that, frankly, the big donors just picked up and applied to the Supreme Court, and that is why we are where we are. Today, these wonderful, wonderful participants, Tiffany and Kris and Doug, have highlighted a number of really poisonous decisions by the Supreme Court that have dramatically harmed the American public. But I want to tell everybody as we close that they are part of a long pattern. I wrote an article that looked at 72 524 decisions of the United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts, in which the decision was 5-4, the split was partisan, and there was a very obvious Republican donor interest involved in that case. And the score in those decisions for the Republican donor interest was 72-0. It was a rout in favor of big Republican donor interests. It has only grown and gotten worse since 6-3. We're over 80 now. So these are low points, if you will, with real public harm, but they fit into a pattern of extremely one-sided and biased decision-making where the best bellwether of where the court's going to come down is what side the big Republican interest is on. Tiffany, thank you for being with us. Kris, thank you so much. Doug, much appreciated. Come on back to the next episode as we continue making the case.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator.